Friends, welcome back to Leading Theologically. I am your host, Bill Davis. I serve as the Senior Director for Theological Education Fund's development at the Presbyterian Foundation, working with the Committee on Theological Education. And today we continue our series on reconciliation. We are joined by the Reverend Dr. Alan Hilton. Alan, welcome to Leading Theologically.
Thanks, Bill. I'm happy to be here.
Friends, Alan is a teacher, facilitator, coach, and speaker who helps communities navigate ideological and cultural differences. He is the executive director of House United and the director of the Institute for Missional Formation at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas. After earning his MDiv at Princeton Seminary and a PhD at Yale University, Alan has served the church in 3 mini careers: as a New Testament professor at St. Mary's College of California, and then at the Yale Divinity School. He has served on pastoral teams in large mainline churches, and for the last decade, leading unity work. His book, House United: How the Church Can Save the World, offers hope amid toxic polarization. Alan, I am thrilled to welcome you to this conversation and to our ongoing conversation about reconciliation. Over the last couple of weeks, me and our guests have talked about reparations and repair. We've talked about peace and reconciliation and the intersection of those things. We've talked about how meal tables might be used as a place to foster community and reconciliation. So as we get to know you some, tell us a little bit about your ministry at House United and the specific type of reconciliation that you're working to foster within the church and world.
Thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about such a good and important topic. So I looked around 15 years ago or so and started to see that people I liked in the left wing of the church and the right wing of the church didn't like each other. And the problem was that they didn't know each other, right? And they were speaking from a distance and stereotyping one another. And it grieved me for a while. And then it started to accelerate as a phenomenon that we're now calling polarization. That's when sociologists and I knew about it, but not many other people were thinking about it. But in 2012, I hosted or facilitated the first courageous conversation that I had. It was about the marriage amendment in Minneapolis, St. Paul in Minnesota. And we had 425 people come out and talk to one another who disagreed. And that sort of set the hook for me on a calling to actually try to get left and right, different cultures, different races, talking to one another rather than assuming things about one another from a different distance. Because all of my own transformations on former bias have come through experience of the other that interrupted whatever I thought before. And so I tried to set up a way of being in the world and then a way of helping other people be in the world that is transformative through experience of talking to one another across ideological difference, experience of being together on neutral sites, just building a house or helping at a soup kitchen or doing whatever things they would have done anyway as Christian folk, but that they do together, and then they know one another a bit and they start to like one another, and they can't believe it because they know what each other thinks, and the ice kind of melts a bit, right? It doesn't immediately, it's not just kind of a Shazam, it's over, but there's an opening for engagement that wouldn't have been there if they hadn't come together. So it's an experience-based ministry, and a lot of the sort of stock and trade is conversations, big room conversations, small family conversations, corporate team conversations, anything that will help a group realize that they can collaborate and that their differences actually are assets rather than threats. So that's the move, is to get people to like difference,
Hmm.
because it helps them, rather than fear difference because it will hurt them. And so on the ground, I lead conversations, facilitate them. I try to do skill building workshops that help people figure out how to listen better to one another, how to
Hmm.
wait beyond the 10 seconds after which we usually roll our eyes if somebody disagrees, um,
Yeah.
and make their way through to actually understanding the biography that leads to the viewpoints.
Hmm.
And as they get to know people, they actually listen better to what the people think and why they think it. So that's a quick run. I like to hear
Yeah.
from people who have sort of brought difference together for a living.
Yeah.
Military folks, sports coaches, business
Yep.
people who know they can make better widgets if they get
Huh.
viewpoint diversity in play. So
Yeah.
that I like to listen to folks like that and then try to bring this principles into practice for others.
Yeah. So, Alan, I already have a question that's going to diverge for us,
Yeah,
right?
I love it.
So, in my theological training, I have degrees from Columbia Seminary and Candler School of Theology at Atlanta, yet I've served as a pastor for 10 years here in Denver, Colorado. One
Yep.
of the things I noticed is that geographic location makes a difference when we're having this conversation about
Yes.
diversity,
Yep.
because here in Denver, we have to be big tent purple around all sorts of issues because we don't have critical mass otherwise.
Um,
As you lead these conversations, do you find that geographic location plays a role in people's willingness to engage with other?
So I have a friend from graduate school, one of my closest friends, who, when I started House United, I thought first I'm going to go to her. She's a biblical scholar. She has a good sense of right and left, and she has history with both parts. And I called her and said, I'm starting this new thing. Can you be a part of it? Can your church do this? And she's a she's a theological educator who also is a devout church person and
Hmm.
in Dallas, Texas. And that led her to respond less enthusiastically than I expected,
Hmm.
but for good reason. She
Hmm.
she said, "Alan, I believe in what you're doing, and our church is the only haven for gay and lesbian men and women in our whole area. And
Hmm.
so we would be failing at our mission
Hmm.
if we stopped being a haven for them, and we aren't free right now to be red blue on that."
Hmm.
And and so uh so it has uh I geographical, it has a relationship to where people are both culturally and geographically. I think
Yeah.
it's just back to your question, right?
Yeah.
um how does geography impact? Well, geography and culture are a big issue as we look at these issues. What I have found interestingly, Bill, is I teach continuing ed for Yale Divinity School. I teach Bible
Hmm.
studies or Bible classes, um, and during the latter part of COVID, we did a Romans study,
Hmm.
and I had 250 people a night on Zoom with Yale Div, and they were in Jamaica, in Hong Kong, in the inner city, in the exurbs, in the suburbs, because on Zoom they had developed a list of participants who were
Hmm.
from everywhere,
Hmm.
culturally, racially, and politically, ideologically, everywhere. It
Hmm.
was the most amazing Bible experience I've ever had,
Wow.
because they weren't pinned in by geography, right? They were
Hmm.
from everywhere, but they could all
Hmm.
meet on a Monday evening and learn Romans together. And so we heard
Hmm.
accents and had people waking up to hear in other time zones. For a 7 p.m. Bible study, they were
Hmm.
waking up
Yeah.
to get to it. And that was instructive for me on the question you're asking,
Yeah.
because there's an extra geographical or beyond geography element that I think the church isn't quite maximizing yet. And I happened into it, but
Yep.
that the reason I noticed that is exactly why you're asking the question, right?
Hmm.
There are
Yep.
places of ideological segregation. There are
Hmm.
also places You mentioned you mentioned your church in churches in Denver kind of need
Yep.
to embrace both, or they don't have enough folks.
Yep. Yeah.
There there was a study done uh, on small college campuses versus large university campuses on
Mm.
how well people mixed. And it
Mhm.
turned out, of course, they mixed better on a small campus because there wasn't any other game in town. But on a
Yeah.
big campus, people flocked like to like,
Mhm.
and because they could, right?
Yep.
But I think being shoved together helps this along in a way.
Mhm.
Um, I just always am pretty sensitive to what cultural and sort of theological pockets are in play, um,
Mhm.
just on the same lines as your question, right? Um,
Yeah.
uh, Being sensitive to that makes me go into churches differently depending on where they are. Yeah.
Totally, totally. So, Alan, you've already mentioned one of the things you enjoy doing with folks when you get into a room together is introducing folks to their own biographies and one another's biographies,
Right.
right? In the book that absolutely devoured in preparation for some time with you. I love the way that you put this. You say we have an issue with our genes. On
Mhm.
page 31, you write this. We 21st century Christians come by our divisiveness honestly. We have inherited it from our ancient Christian ancestors. In spite of Jesus's prayer that they may all be one, our first century founders sometimes acted more like enemies than friends. The earliest churches battled one another over everything from how to distribute the offering plate money to which of their prophets spoke truth and which falsehood, to whether Moses' law provided access to God or threw up a blockade on the pathway to God. In fact, the same Johannine community that gave us the gospel with Jesus' prayer for Christian unity also gave us one of the most striking versions of early Christian division. That is some of the history that we have inherited as the
Mhm.
church and followers of Christ today. And so you go on to talk about other divisions in the early church and between authors of texts. So here's my wondering, Alan, what
Mhm.
can we learn from the early church about how to be reconciled to one another and to God?
Yeah. It's a great question. And one of the first thing that comes to mind is what, 50, 60 years after Jesus spoke things, uh, Matthew came back and sort of illustrated the necessity in Jesus's mind of going toward one another when we harm one another. Because
Mm,
in Matthew 18, he
mhm,
says, if if a person sins against you, if a brother or sister sins against you, go and make your claim be known. And if they say, "Oh, I'm sorry," then all will be well. You've reconciled. But if not, get another person and go. And if not that, bring them before the whole congregation.
yep,
And if not that, treat them as a gatherer or a heathen, right?
yep.
And so in Matthew 18, it's if I'm harmed, I go,
Mm,
right? In Matthew 5, if you're leaving a gift at the altar and realize that someone has something against you,
mm,
go and be reconciled to them. And so if you sense you've done something, or if you sense something's been done to you, Jesus says run. And that that matters for your whole series. That matters, right? The
mm,
center of reconciliation in Jesus's economy is kind of clear from those two passages and a whole lot of others, right?
mhm,
So that's what first comes to mind. But
mhm,
the other insight, I think, is, I work in unity. I try
mm,
hard to work with congregations, and they always feel like, oh, this is hard. I don't know if we can do it. And I said, don't worry. Neither could Paul and
mhm.
James. Neither could,
That's
right.
right.
This is a hard thing. The people we put halos around their heads on our icons, they didn't do it so well. They had to learn it. They had to work at it. It's sort of a part of who we are as humans, even with the Spirit. And what I hold hope in with them is that generation handed on what they did, and they did it well, and with their scrapes and bruises and missteps regarding connected unity,
Hmm.
they still made it, and they handed something on to us, and we still get Jesus's prayer, right? We
Mm,
still inherit the hope and aspiration, even as we
mm,
inherit the tendencies, right?
yeah.
The third thing is just original unity is a myth, and that's sort of where I'm coming off. A lot of people think the early church was perfect and then things fell. The early church wasn't perfect, and
Right.
it's a consolation to a lot of people to realize that.
Yeah, and Alan, I'm thinking back, it's been a long time since I've had some like early Christianity patristics classes, but one of the things that like places my mind is going is to the community of the Didache, right? And the two paths that are presented to converts, right? The
Yeah,
path of righteousness and the way of Christ, and the path of evil foolishness,
yeah,
right? And so just thinking about unity in the path of Christ, that we all may be one, we get presented with lots of choices. And the question is, are we going to engage difference or are we not? Right?
yep,
It seems to me like the choice isn't about reconciliation, it's about engagement.
right. Right. And I mentioned Jamie's church at the time. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's still functioning in the same way. Um, there are times when at least corporate engagement, and Paul talked about this a little last week. White church wants to have courageous conversation with black church and thinks they start on an equal level. Right.
Yep.
That's an underestimation of the historic harms.
Yep.
It the relationship is skewed enough that it has to be addressed on other levels before let's talk together about whatever. And so
Yep.
I think the impetus, the impulse, the hope for engagement
Hmm.
is a wonderful thing when it shows up, and
Hmm.
it it seems to me it's more complicated than just so let's have a conversation. um,
Hmm.
Assessing how that engagement might look at its first time in its first
Mm.
iteration feels to me
Hmm.
like a wise question, right?
Mm.
The I did a cohort, and so this is one of the things that House United has hatched recently is a what I'm
Yeah.
calling a House United cohort, and we had 8 churches from around the nation, Missouri Synod on one end, and very progressive UCC on the other, and
Mm.
some middle, and just a whole lot of different positions on the screen, and we met every Tuesday
Yeah.
night for all the months of the election season from late
Mm.
September through till January after the inauguration.
Mhm.
And what I discovered was in that setting, we had a couple of churches that were historically black, and in that setting of a come one, come all, there
Mm.
was a whole lot of pain in coming into the conversation as if we're starting together, and it was a deep learning for me. I had
Sure.
really good conversations with some of the folks from one of the historically black
Mhm.
churches, and they said, "We love what you're doing. It's just too painful to be in the
Mm.
room as if and not talk about those things first." And
Mhm.
so it was a learning for me. Not that I didn't know it before, that I underestimated its impact or its pain.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think engagement as an instinct of the church, as a hope
Mm.
of the church, is
Mhm.
a great thing. And then comes, well, how does that best work given whom we'll be engaging with, and how that kind of what does it look like to engage wisely and humanely given
Mhm.
whatever has happened before this day.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it does, and I think the engagement question, Alan, leads me to this next one, right? Because one of the things that we engage with more today than maybe ever before are these little mini computers that we hold in our hands most of the day, right?
Yeah.
We engage with our social media and our echo chambers. We engage with these AI algorithms that shape the way that we consume information. And you write about this in your book. On page 95, you say this: the larger issue in all of this is human flourishing. It's time to challenge our culture's unproven and unconsidered assumption that flocking with birds of our own feather produces flourishing lives, individually and nationally. It's time for us to ask, what would it look like? How would we read or hear news? How would we choose our neighborhoods and our churches and our friends? How would we even treat one another in a church and nation that could properly be called a house united? So I
Mhm.
wonder if you'll say more about your search for a new algorithm and how we might differently and more positively consume news and information during this time of just mass chaos on so many levels.
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of the going question. How do we get to a common body of information or fact or data? How do we operate on at least some common? When I was in grad school, the issue was: do we have a Western canon or not? Do we read the same things we've always read before, or do we infuse them? And there was a lot of resistance to infusing with new cultures. And what I think has happened among us right now is two sides are consuming very different pictures of the world, and it's not
Mm,
just two sides. I That's a little too simplistic, right? There are splinters in both political parties. There are, the way that we do theological fundamentalism or theological
mm,
progressivism is broken into different parts. And but but I think the common lesson for the whole lot is: if we don't start moving toward one another and actually realizing, I don't want to be locked in my echo chamber, I don't want to be in the corner of the narrative that is what I already think. Arthur C. Brooks, who teaches
mm,
at Harvard now, he was American Enterprise Institute president before that. He recently was on Morning Joe, I think, and
mm,
presented. It was soon enough after the election that it was in the air. Was maybe leading up to the inauguration, and they asked him about Flourish because he's teaching happiness and thriving at Harvard, and
mhm,
he said, we need one another to be different, because lives aren't as full. Research shows it, experience shows it, anecdotes show it. Not Life's not as full if we hear just what we want,
mm,
right? And that's a big issue in the breakdown of the culture, I think, right now. Now,
mhm,
there is a counterweight to that in the way we're built. In my book, I think I mentioned, but I know I mention it a lot when I talk. Ben Sass, the senator from Nebraska, conservative senator from Nebraska, um, wrote a book called Them, in which he has a great chapter on why we turn to like-minded people. And in it, he features research that I'd never seen before I read his book, in which they put sensors on the brains of people and had them sit in front of television. If they were conservatives, had them sit in front of Fox News. If they were progressives, had them sit in front of MSNBC and just listen. And it turned out that the part of the brain that lit up was similar to the part of the brain that's lit up by friendship, right?
mm,
um, and by opioids. Right. There's in a lonely culture, Cigna and the loneliness epidemic, and
yep,
in a lonely culture, we've got people who substitute the talking heads on the screen for actual friends, right?
yeah,
I can feel like I have a friend if I listen to and name the pundit, right?
mm,
If I listen to that person who agrees with me, or if I go on Facebook and go to the pages or follow the blog, or I can simulate friendship on one of these
mhm,
little screens that you're
mhm,
talking about. And
yep,
and so, how to rechannel in the church, how to rechannel the national enculturation to tribalism and to
yeah,
like-mindedness, or birds of a feather. It feels like, at least biblically, we've got a foothold in a couple places. One is
mm,
1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12. Variety of
yep,
gifts, right? One spirit.
Yep.
Uh, we don't operate with one body part. If we were all elbows or all eyes, we wouldn't work very well, right?
Mhm.
And so uh, Paul's claim is that we're very glad we're different from one another. If
Mhm.
we weren't, we wouldn't function as well. We couldn't do all
Mhm.
the things that we're called to do, but we also wouldn't enjoy, right?
Mhm.
Bodies work better if they've got all the parts going. And
Mhm.
the signature one for me, though, Paul plays it out more extensively. But in Luke 6,
Mhm.
Jesus is praying on the mountain, and he comes down to name the disciples that he's going to, the 12 who are
Mhm.
going to go with him the rest of the time. And in that group are two opposites on the most controversial political issue of his
Yeah.
day, which
Yep.
is just outlandish HR work, right?
Yep.
You got
Yes.
Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity in
Yep.
the same 12-person room,
Yeah.
and yet Jesus did that, and I don't think he was just showing off. I think he was probably saying this is a better way to live.
Yeah.
We should not say, okay, this is where I stand, therefore I'll recruit people who are just like me. Um,
Yep.
and I happen to think that when he got to Jerusalem and was asked, should we pay taxes? Right? Jesus gets to Jerusalem,
Mm.
Matthew 22, Mark 12, maybe. And he's asked, and he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is. I have a feeling he crafted that listening to Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector, right? Those nights by the campfire when they were going at it, and
Yeah.
he figured out what's a good way to navigate this. So I think Jesus grounds it not only in his prayer but in that
Yeah.
choice, which is again, it just goes beyond me that he did that. And then Paul's laying out of the theological purpose for it, which is
Mm.
variety is God's gift. It's not, again, we're back to square one. It's not something to be feared, it's something to be prized.
Yeah. Right. So I've been, as you've been reflecting on that variety and how, how we get to that place of, how we get towards a place of unity. One of the places my mind goes, because I'm a musician, I always go to songs, and I've been
Mhm.
thinking of this song, and I tried looking up to find the lyrics and I couldn't find them all, but it's one of your Yale colleagues, Mark Miller, wrote this beautiful hymn text called When There's Trust in the Room, and I'll find it and link to it in the comments, right? But the line that I remember over and over that we sing is, when there's trust in the room, we can breathe. Right? I think so much of being together in unity is breathing together, right?
Mm,
It's embodied. If we can get out of our heads and into our hearts together,
yeah.
isn't that where unity starts to take shape, Alan?
Yeah, I think so. And by the way, singing together isn't a bad idea. Eating together at table isn't a bad idea, right?
Yeah.
You've recently talked about that. Yeah, I think that's right. And here's that brings a sort of another odd thing about Jesus into play,
Huh.
because if you comb the Gospels, and I used to do this for a living, the New
Yeah.
Testament kind of thing for a living. If you comb the Gospels and just have two categories,
Mhm.
orthodoxy and community, right? What to believe and how to be together. And you just pile up Jesus's teaching, there's a whole lot more about how to be in community than there is about what to believe or think.
Mhm.
And it wasn't very long before the church inverted that, right?
Mm.
Before the church began to make claims on orthodoxy that were inside outside claims. The things that Jesus said you can toss people out for, and that Paul said you can toss people out for, were um, Jesus said if somebody keeps sinning against you and doesn't stop, then treat him as a Gentile or tax collector. Paul said you've got a guy who's sleeping with his father's wife.
Mm.
It was a breach of sexual conduct and a whole lot of harm. Neither of those had anything to do with what those people thought or believed, right?
Mhm.
But early on, the church started a criterion that was on the other side of that ledger and said, what we say, what we believe, is more important than community and whom we associate with. And so I think that inversion has hurt the ball club. And we've
Yeah.
kept going with it because there's a lot of self-righteousness to be had in it and all those things.
Yep.
But what you're describing,
Yep.
breathing together,
Yeah.
breathing together before we think, right?
Yeah.
Breathing
Right.
together as we think, breathing together after we've thought, is I think a part of the solution. And in the in the practice of getting people to listen to one another, the reason I go to biography before what they believe is then people start breathing together before they start thinking,
Yeah.
right? Before they start parlaying about whatever issue it is. Because the
Mhm.
standard, it's called a life swap, and I do it in all the places where I go. I
Mhm.
pair people off one and
Mhm.
one,
Mhm.
and say, okay, ask two questions. One, what what is your political disposition or orientation? And two, what in your life led you to those beliefs? Well,
Mm.
what in your life led you to those beliefs is a biographical run. So tell your story. And by the
Yep.
time they've told their story, the other person will listen in ways that they would not have if it had been a placard. This is what
Mm.
I believe, you know. So breathing together matters.
Yep. Well, and thinking about the storytelling, right? I love that the Lilly Endowment has an emphasis on
Yeah,
storytelling right now.
yeah,
Austin Seminary just got this Lilly grant to cultivate workshops and educational opportunities around storytelling, right?
yeah.
I was at an event with the Omaha Presbyterian Seminary Foundation this past fall that was around storytelling, where we
Neat.
had leaders from the Moth come and teach us how to craft good stories, right?
Nice.
So, like, I mean, because when we tell a story, it's inviting someone else into our narrative. It's saying, let me tell you about me so that maybe as I'm sharing about who I am, you hear about who you are too.
Yep.
Right? Isn't that what a good story does? It's invitational.
Yeah.
And Alan, I've been struck too. I've been thinking back to you telling the story of your colleague in Dallas who said, this isn't for us right now, right? Because part of what I think we I worry about, especially because when I think about reconciliation in the Presbyterian Church USA, I think about these three words that have been a stumbling block, I think, for decades. I think about peace, unity, and purity,
Mm,
right?
mm.
And so I think unity is possible, but at what sense and at what cost for those that we're asking to be unified with one another, right? Um, So you end your book talking about unity.
Right.
Riff on that a little bit for us,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
if you
So
would.
so the one of the just coming off your reference to peace, purity, and unity.
Yeah.
One of the dynamics that develops in the course of trying to bring people together is there is a great deal of difficulty, and it usually shows up in the progressive side of
Mhm,
the ledger or the
mhm,
continuum, to include the non-includer, right?
mm,
That's where the sticking point is on the left. On the right, there is sometimes an orthodoxy pushback, or I mean, there
mhm.
variety. I don't want to overcharacterize here or
Yeah,
oversimplify,
yeah.
but one of the reasons why the left or the progressive voices sometimes recoil at including the non-includer is there are people in the room whose identity and life um, are being called into question by the
Mhm,
by the person who, for instance, doesn't think gay marriage is blessed by God,
mhm,
right? People in the room whose daily lives and whose relationships are being uh, adjudicated in that conversation, and what sometimes doesn't get appreciated on and I
mhm,
appreciate that, right? But what
mhm,
sometimes doesn't get appreciated on the left about the right is that its identity and sort of deeply um, it's a deep part of someone to believe certain things. And so disallowing someone who's a non-includer
Mhm.
into a church or a conversation is not at the same level an offense, right? Not, but
Mm.
there's a minimalization of the difference there. I mean,
Mm.
they I think I said that wrongly. There's there's an inability to appreciate. I in progressive churches, when I do conversations in blue churches, there will be a handful of red people,
Mhm.
and what progressives don't sometimes appreciate is I have to talk to some of the conservative folks, and they'll be in tears at the prospect of going into the room because they know they're
Mm.
the ones who are going to get stigmatized, and they're the ones who are going to be the butt of the jokes and the obviously wrong ones. And that's
Mhm.
hard for progressives to appreciate because they picture conservatives as the kind of the strong bully, and
Mhm.
it's not my experience that that's true. It's my experience that the minority voice in the room is usually the one
Mm.
that's most threatened,
Yeah.
whatever the form of the minority. And so, I think in response to your question, I think there's a lot of sort of high level wisdom required to ask, how does inclusion go in order for harms not to be inflicted in the room? But everybody's got to be a part of that
Yep.
question, right? And the the other the other thing that matters to me about the question you just asked is, I had an experience that flipped, and it's in the book. You may have run across it. I had an experience that flipped my view of inclusion. Um,
Mm.
in, Inclusion before for me had kind of gotten to the place where we're so good, we'll let you in. We'll even
Yeah.
let you in. We're such good people. We will even allow you to come to our blessed place, right? Or the center of gravity is the including body,
Mhm.
and they feel pretty good about themselves. They pat themselves on the back.
Mhm.
But I had a friend introduce an example that was just opposite that, where
Mhm.
inclusion comes not because we are so good we'll allow you, it comes because we need you.
Mm.
Who's missing among us, right?
Yeah.
We can't be as much a shalom community, we can't be as much a body of Christ if you're not a part of us. And so we hope you'll come and join us, or we hope we can be in community with you. But it's not because we're just that good, we're just that 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 righteous a people that we can let you in.
Yeah.
You're you have stuff we don't have. You are part of what God might make this whole community into, and that's
Mm.
a different way. I think Jesus tried to combat arrogance wherever it happened. I
Yep.
think time after time, it's in his crosshairs. I won't use crosshairs, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
It's Jesus goes right after arrogance in the Pharisee and the publican. He goes right after arrogance wherever he finds it, and we've got so much arrogance right now.
Yeah.
We've got it's we're What did Jonathan Sachs say? Humility is the orphan virtue of our age, right?
Mm.
So how to go into who gets to be in the conversation, who all can be a part of the unity,
Mhm.
has to at least somehow start with, I don't have all the answers and mine may be wrong, right?
Mm.
Some
Yeah.
kind of humility, of that sets the table for, I don't know, humane interaction.
Yeah. Speaking of humane interaction, right?
Yeah.
We're having this conversation virtually. We're going to be together in Allens Park, Colorado, outside of Estes Park. So, for our listeners that want more of this conversation, that want to dive more into how we are reconciled together, how we um, build communities like this, Alan and I will be together for an event with the Omaha Presbyterian Seminary Foundation, October 6th through 9th at Highlands Camp and Retreat Center. Alan will be leading a transformative retreat to explore the inner architecture of an authentic, united church community. We'll be doing this through engaging dialogue. Pastors will be guided in how to break the silence and rebuild connection, creating space to recharge, embrace unity, and build a spirit-led community across differences. And we'll drop the link so that folks can learn more about that in the comments. But Alan, I can't wait to do more planning with you for that event and to be there in October with you here in these beautiful Colorado Rocky Mountains.
Yes, I'm excited about it.
So, Alan, a final question. I am grateful for your time and your passion to talk about reconciliation, unity, and how we all might be one in Jesus Christ. One of the things that I've noticed, especially today, is that we hear lots of noise, whether it's sportscasters because it's March Madness, or political talking heads, or meteorologists telling us about the way we're killing the earth. We hear so much noise. So, Alan Hilton, I wonder, what is the best thing that you've heard lately?
Yeah, it's a great question, because my boys were just home from school. They both go to liberal arts schools in Connecticut, and they came home for spring break, and so we had them in the place, and I was struck by how much their generation has looked at a half full glass or a half empty glass, and seen it as less than half. Right? They have lived through school shootings, through through Trump administration, and all that went into that, this whole period in American political history and church history. And what I'm not going to isolate them. What I'm struck by is the continuation of hope. When I hear hope, that there is another side, that God has been there before. Church has been through harder things than currently it's going through. The futility narrative gives way to hope and aspiration, and I've heard it. I can't quote it because I've heard it in a whole lot of different places in the last couple months. Just this sense that it could be different than whatever I see as not being right. Everybody is saying, I don't like where things are going, right? If you isolate it from the president, everybody is saying we're in a worse place than we were. There are all kinds of narratives of decline. I love hearing people who say, and we got this, right? And the Spirit has this, and God has this, because there have been a whole lot of times when people could have given up hope and gone to futility, and lo and behold, they came out the other side, right? So where I told somebody yesterday, I'm a hope peddler. If I can at all ignite a flame in anybody that says God is bigger than this, I mean, Red Sea, empty tomb, all kinds of indicators say that American toxic political polarization is probably not bigger than God, right? Neither is American racial strife. Neither is that God has done things bigger than this, and futility is not in order.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
That's a good word to end on right there, my friend. Hope in God, hope in getting through all of this. Alan Hilton, thank you so much for joining us here at Leading Theologically. Friends, Leading Theologically is a mission and ministry of the Presbyterian Foundation and the Theological Education Fund. You can find out more about the Theological Education Fund at presbyterianfoundation.org/TEF. Take a look at all the links in the comments. Alan, blessings on you and your ministry. We'll look forward to being with you again soon.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you, Bill.